Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to another episode of Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd.
Thanks, Brad. We have another powerful story today, and by powerful, I mean massive dumpster fire. Quick question. Do you trust me?
That's way too broad of a question.
Okay, let me focus it in. Do you trust me not to take money from our law firm bank account for my own personal use?
Much better question, of course.
Well, you have something in common with our story today. Our client trusted one of the highest people in their organization with their money. The season's theme is dumpster fires, so I'm betting you can guess how this worked out.
Probably not well. I'm excited to share today's story, but Michael, first, let me ask you a random question. What are the different ways to navigate?
Well, that is random, and my wife would attest that I can tell you that I have a GPS in my brain and that I can just instinctively find wherever I need to go. But don't ask her about how successful I am about that.
Okay, well, that's fine. It's a perfectly good answer. So you use the map in your head to get from one place to another. But if you're going to somewhere that you've never been before, what do you do?
Okay, well, this isn't on the record, right?
Right. No one's listening.
Safe space?
Safe space.
All right. Well, then I'll use...
Just between you and me.
Okay. I'll use my iPhone or the GPS in my car to help guide me.
All right. So you're using navigation tools.
And where are you going with this, Brad?
All right. In the modern society, we no longer have these skills that we need to learn how to really navigate a route. Originally, you had to use the stars and maps and compasses to go from point A to point B. But now we just ask our phone or our car or our computer to say, how do I go from here to there? So many of us have either forgotten or actually never even learned how to go from point A to B without the assistance of our phone or car.
So I start talking about trust. You start talking about navigation. What does this have to do with today's episode?
Well, we've all heard of people who follow their GPS verbatim, and so they may have just driven the car right into a lake. And if you ever read these incidents, the app that the person was following will have all their normal disclaimers, but they'll often say, people should, quote, use all environmental information available to make the best decision as they drive. Basically, use your common sense.
I have a funny story about that. My oldest son, Christopher, when he got his driver's license several years ago, was going to visit a family member in the hospital. He typed in Baylor, which is a local healthcare system in Dallas, and followed the directions to a Baylor facility an hour away. The actual hospital was only 10 minutes from our house. Anyway, where are you going with all this again?
All right. Just like your son, and in this case, the person who drives their car in a lake, these are preventable by just kind of monitoring your surroundings and learning the basics of land navigation. The same thing happens when you start your business. You start understanding these basic ways in which you bring money in, collect it, and you pay your vendors. But as your business grows, you add more employees, and you want to make sure you're still going the right path. And as the owner of the business, you must confirm that those leaders, those employees that you're adding, are taking you in the right direction. You can never lose sight of those same basics that you started your business with. You should trust your leaders, but verify the route they set matches where your actual surroundings are.
Agree. Well, let's get going with today's episode and introduce our special guest, Jay Reyero. Many of you who have listened have heard that name before. He's been a repeat offender on our show, and so it kind of feels wrong to do the formal introduction again. So let's do it a little different today. Jay, why don't you tell us a funny story about you?
So I'll keep it in line with the theme of navigation. So I did a little bit of litigation early in my career, and I had a hearing in Collin County, which is the first time I ever had to go there. So like Christopher, I plugged in the address and to the GPS and headed on my way. And as I'm getting close to my destination, I'm sitting there stunned by how this court is literally located in the middle of nowhere. But then that sense of panic that sets in when Google says you have arrived at your destination and you are clearly not at your destination. On the road, between some large green open spaces on both sides, not a court building in sight, the hearing was starting in 30 minutes. I had no idea where I was, and immediately panic sets in. I'm thinking I'm going to lose this hearing. I'm going to have to go back. I'm going to have to tell the client and all the people I work with why I lost the hearing. But, long story short, luckily it all worked out fine. I found the court. I didn't end up missing the hearing. And so I didn't have to drive back to the office in shame, but I still literally have no idea how I ended up where I did.
Well, that's a great story. I would say the story today revolves around a client with a unique structure. It was more of an enterprise with several different divisions independently operating underneath one roof.
Yeah, there various different affiliated companies involved, and there'd always been some kind of centralized decision-making group that kind of helped run it. And initially, it was just comprised of the founders, but eventually they grew to start adding certain key members.
But even with this group in place, not surprisingly, they constantly face the struggle of keeping up with the day-to-day operations of the enterprise as a whole because of the responsibilities associated with their own divisions. For the longest time, they really needed someone who was going to be dedicated to the whole enterprise without having any other responsibilities.
Yeah, and we had a lot of conversations with this client about this particular point. And they always agreed that they needed somebody, but there just wasn't enough time to ever conduct that search, and they were just too busy. But finally, they found someone who had the experience and the ability to help them set the role that they wanted, and they felt a huge weight lifted because this individual had a strong financial background, they had accounting background, prior experience as an executive level, so they brought him on to be their chief financial officer.
I think for purposes of today's story, we should call the CFO Pinocchio.
I like that. I see where you're going here, except this Pinocchio's wallet grew every time he lied and said his nose.
Well, that makes me think of last episode where we talked about Coke being bad for your teeth, and our star was Dr. Nose. I think whenever he lied, his nose actually fell off.
I remember when Pinocchio was hired, there was a great amount of trust placed in him because, they immediately appointed him as the primary point of contact for us as well, and all of his other responsibilities. And so we were no longer having to jump around to different people, depending on what divisions were involved. And he became the voice of that centralized decision-making group.
And he played an important part in their growth over the next 4 to 5 years as he was able to take responsibility of the overall enterprise operations and explore new opportunities that may have been examined previously. I know for us, dealing with him on a day-to-day basis, we had a better sense of everything that was happening. But Brad, it was you who the client reached out to initially when something questionable was discovered.
Yeah, I remember the phone call clearly. It was about 6 p.m. I got a phone call from on my cell, and what happened earlier that day, one of the founders had been brought a stack of papers and checks to sign. This is not unusual in any case. This happens often. You're busy people. Your staff tries to find time in which you can start signing off checks to pay your vendors. And this was no difference, but this is typically the way in which people do things to be more effective.
So what was different this time?
Well, the founder, when they were going through the checks and he was about to sign it, something just kind of caught his eye, and it was just a vendor that the founder wasn't really familiar with. He couldn't ever remember hearing about this vendor before, so he just asked one of the staff members to look into it and find out exactly who this vendor was, and just to check more into it.
I remember the check being for a couple $1,000, so nothing big or out of the ordinary for this size of a company.
And I think that was the key. Typically, an amount like this for an organization this size, that would go unnoticed. So it probably falls below a threshold where a discussion or approval needs to occur. It just so happened in this case, it wasn't really the amount that drew the attention. It was actually the vendor.
Yeah, so the founder team did some more digging. They located the invoice for this particular vendor, and the amount to be paid matched the unsigned check. So everything looked normal. The invoice matched, and it was a standard-looking invoice.
Jay, do you remember what the invoice said that they were paying for?
Yeah, it was some very generic description for some type of data analysis. Nothing that on its face you would see and think something was wrong. And like Brad said, it looked like any other standard invoice.
Yeah, but things kind of started taking a turn And they just kept digging into it to determine what this vendor was, what was the vendor doing for the company. And then they found out that Pinocchio, their current CFO, had actually formed this company a few years ago. Now, the founder was obviously alarmed by this discovery, but was hopeful there was a good explanation. But he wanted to dig even deeper before really speaking with Pinocchio.
Yeah, but what they found eventually made it hard to still be hopeful. There were numerous monthly invoices from the same company for almost a 2-year period, all of which had been paid. And not only that, but the issue wasn't limited to just one division. In fact, this company had issued invoices to multiple divisions each month over the same time frame. All were for the same services, just the amounts on a monthly basis were different.
In total, it was hundreds of thousands of dollars that our client had paid to this company owned by Pinocchio. The only question really remaining was, were these legitimate services that had been paid for?
And that's what they asked Pinocchio. Once they conducted this initial investigation, they immediately confronted him with what they had uncovered, and the only question remaining was why. And at first, Pinocchio tried to convince them that Pinocchio was actually doing acquiring this data on behalf of the company, and the company was just reimbursing him for the work that he was getting done. The problem was he couldn't either specify or as to whoever requested this data, or actually produce any of the data or reports that he actually been paying for. And then shockingly, when he finally just realized he was caught, his demeanor just instantly changed and became very matter-of-fact about the situation and basically showed no remorse for what he had been caught doing.
I remember on the client side, there were a lot of emotions. At first, it was hurt because Pinocchio was someone they trusted and had actually done a good job while working there. He was a savior in the beginning, took a lot of off their plates from an administrative perspective. But then I remember the anger as they discussed what they should do and how they should handle the situation.
Given that Pinocchio was in charge of the books and funds, there were plenty of opportunities for him to divert funds from this organization, from our client. And so there was this huge fear and dread that it was unknown how much more money that they had taken from him. So we immediately coordinated with a forensic accounting firm to come in and figure out what had happened. And fortunately for our client, even though they lost hundreds of thousands of dollars, the extent of the harm didn't go beyond what they had initially discovered.
All of us have experienced a breach of trust in our lives at some point, and an extreme breach of trust like this, when they're dealing with really the livelihood of your business, is massive. I mean, this is a unfortunate dumpster fire, and really, if not for the almost accidental red flag on identifying the vendor, this could have been much, much worse. So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll discuss the strategies businesses can take to prevent this from happening to them.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise. Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
Welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd, and we're still here with our special guests and repeat offender, Jay Reyero. And in Season 3, we've been discussing dumpster fires, and we've got one burning right now. We just told a story of how the CFO of a client took advantage of his position of trust and was able to divert a significant amount of money for personal gain. And we don't use this term embezzlement, but that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, and the story reminds me of a former CFO of a biotech company who was actually sentenced to prison last year, and he embezzled about $1 million from his company. He used the corporate credit card for personal expenses, but because he was in charge of payroll, he also, over a period of time, wrote checks to himself that he disguised as quote-unquote bonuses. He also gave himself unauthorized additional salary payments. And when the company found out what he was doing, they found that his annual salary was actually more than twice what he was entitled to get.
Yeah, I think it's important for our listeners to understand that the term embezzlement can have a pretty broad meaning. kind of simply, it can, means that the fraudulently taking of property or money that's been trusted to you for your own use or benefit. But there's a variety of ways this can occur. It's not just stealing cash, but it can be overstating work hours, like Jay mentioned, using corporate credit cards for personal expenses, or paying yourself unauthorized payments, or in the case of our client, using fake companies to divert funds.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened in this particular case, but any business of any size needs to be thinking about this. That's also why it's difficult to give clients, hey, what should we do? There's no one-size-fits-all approach. But that doesn't mean a business shouldn't try to implement as many safeguards as possible. I think the first place you can look to during the hiring phase by conducting background checks and references, particularly for those who will be handling funds or in a place of a superior trust position.
Yeah, I agree with Brad, and it's really important to understand that there are employment laws in each state that dictate how and when these background checks can occur. So you have to be sure you're following the correct process to properly conduct those background checks.
And I also think it's important that a business not be lulled into that false sense of security if they don't find anything alarming on these background checks, because the strategy really isn't a guarantee. I mean, whether there are confidential settlement agreements in place or, most of the time the person just hasn't been caught yet, there's still reasons why you may not uncover anything or find out some past bad actions.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And unfortunately, we know many incidences where it turns out that person was a bad actor before. So what other safeguards could a business put in place, Jay?
Well, one would be making sure you have good, solid accounting controls. This would include periodic audits, particularly of cash and credit card statements. You can also, to the extent possible, separate your bookkeeping, accounting, and financial duties. It makes it easier to set up a scheme if you're the only one involved and have control over the areas where it can be discovered. And as shown in our story, if you're the owner of the business, keep the authority to personally sign checks, but be diligent in reviewing them if they're bulk check signing requests.
Yeah.
Another safeguard is to ensure that there's checks and balances.
Yeah, checks and balance. Michael, why don't you help the audience out? Please explain what that means.
It's kind of a natural extension of what Jay was just talking about with accounting controls. It means setting up a structure that makes it less likely that someone can take advantage of their position, or a structure that makes it more likely to discover something quickly. For example, you can require a multi-step process to include more people, cross-train your employees so that they'll work in different areas at different times, or use outside resources to double-check for potential discrepancies. Imagine someone that holds onto their duties and doesn't delegate or involve anyone, even when they're not available. Basically, they're very protective of what they touch. This could signal something more going on behind the scenes, and you need to check for this. So these checks and balances are meant to disrupt that or prevent the opportunity from starting in the first place.
Yeah, and I think, going back to those checks and balances, another area to really scrutinize who are your vendors. Just like our client, you should ask questions about any vendors that you're not familiar with. Most businesses likely have some common set of vendors that they see, month to month. And so you get familiar with those names. However, going to Jay's point on auditing information, if you see something you don't recognize, say something. Ask the questions, not just who they are, but what do they provide, and did you actually receive it?
These are all great ideas. Jay, what would you suggest a business do with all these strategies?
So any company that's looking to set the tone for how they want their business to run, they rely on their policies and procedures. And here it's really no different, as the company needs to have policies and procedures that are going to cover all of these safeguards. The first step, obviously, is to document them, but more importantly, it should be customized and tailored to reflect the operational workflow of your business. It only works if it works for your business. And as Brad mentioned, there's no one-size-fits-all plan. So using a template or a form document can be dangerous and leave gaps. So you really want to pay attention to kind of the customization of these policies and procedures.
Yeah, and we talk to our clients all the time about policies and procedures, and this could be as simple as putting together your patient privacy policies or your employee policies. But one of the most important follow-ups to the documentation, as Jay just mentioned, is actually implementing them. It's one thing to write them all up, but if you don't actually go in and implement it, it doesn't help you at all. So these policies should be more than just, the binders sitting on a shelf that no one gets to see. It should be documents that are constantly being used and accessible to you and your team. And we always joke that if your policy binder is covered in dust, then you're not doing it right. So, you can hold on your employees accountable if these policies are properly in place, and more importantly, you keep up with them and keep training them.
Yeah, I mean, a great point you just ended with there. So, we have a common scenario where people print something off the internet and stick it on the shelf to gather dust, or someone who takes it to the next level and they actually roll them out. The next thing that is an even more common mistake is not doing anything after it's been rolled out. These policies should be living, breathing documents. We always say compliance is not stagnant, and I think that's applicable here. And that means constantly looking at the policies, but also constantly reinforcing them to your employees and, of course, your new employees that come along the way. So they should be reviewed and audited frequently, and really checking to see how they're working. And you're wanting to look for updates that may be from the business itself, from the law, or some other circumstances.
And Jay, and just for our audience, whatever happened to Pinocchio?
Well, he was arrested, and our client sued him for the hundreds of thousands of dollars that he stole. Unfortunately, as is often the case, there was no money left for our client to see, so they lost not only their trusted CFO, but also all the money and the emotions that came with it.
Yeah, and Jay, so how about some final thoughts for our audience?
So I think going back to one of our season 1 episodes, Don't Be a Lone Wolf, don't try and be a lone wolf when it comes to preventing what happened to our client. And businesses should surround themselves with trusted advisors, both legal, accounting, maybe financial, who can not only help on the front end and getting in place these safeguards we've talked about, but also could be one of those checks and balances that Michael talked about, a resource in a position to catch potential issues.
Yeah, I agree with those safeguards in place. That way you can trust but verify the information that you're receiving, that it actually adds up. And Michael, some final words?
Well, going back to the beginning, monitor your surroundings within the business. You don't want to find yourself driving into a lake or in an open field looking for the courthouse.
Perfect. Well, please join us next Wednesday when we have a special guest, a podcaster and former undercover police officer, Rob Griffin, will be joining us. Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe, make sure to give us a 5-star rating, and share with your friends.
You can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.